Hello, this is John Moore, and this is a supplemental episode from World Organic News. My friend and colleague Rich Bowden and I have released a new podcast entitled The Real Food Chain. So I'm including the first episode here because I thought you might find it interesting. If you wish to subscribe, just go to iTunes and search Real Food Chain. Thanks, and here's the podcast.
Hello, welcome to episode 1 of the Real Food Chain podcast. I'm your host, Rich Bowden, and with my friend and co-host John Moore, I'll be bringing you news and views, interviews and ideas about all things whole foods and organic. We'll be talking to people on topics as wide-ranging as gut health, fermented foods, foraging, where to buy organic foods, and how to grow your own organic veggies. Yep, that's easy, says co-host and organic farmer John Moore. So are you interested in introducing organic foods to your diet? Check us out at the Real Food Chain website and podcast. Earlier in the week I caught up with John from his home in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, New South Wales. Now, John, we've had discussions before about organic food being called freaky food. Can you give us a little bit of information about that from a food producer and consumer's view?
Well, from a producer's point of view, organic was what used to be called food. My grandfather and my great-grandparents all grew their own food in the backyard using chook manure basically as their fertiliser and crop rotations. So once upon a time, the only food was organic food. With the freely available large amounts of nitrogen after the Second World War that was used in the ammunition sector, now having nowhere to go, they decided they'd sell it as plant fertiliser. And while it did do some good, it also destroyed a lot of the soil biota. So by returning to organic methods, we can actually rebuild the soil, suck carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in the soil where it belongs, and actually feed ourselves quite well and in a healthy way.
One of the great things we found when we moved out to the country, John, was the fact that growing organic food is still a great tradition in the country. I mean, we do have the farms here, but you just pop down the road and you'll see about 3 or 4 signs that will say free-range eggs, and you can buy from their gate. Also, there's a great tradition I noticed out here for making pickles, which is fantastic. I hadn't had pickles for so long. And a guy just gave me a jar of pickles when I bought a table off him, and he said, have you tried these? And I said, not for a while. And he said, go for it. Threw it at me. It's fantastic. And I found out that it's country tradition, which I'm very happy with, which kind of brings me to the fact that we will be featuring quite a few articles and also podcasts on fermented foods as we go on. Fermented foods, of course, has become quite in the news lately with the whole thing on gut health and how the microbes in the gut do control a lot of how good our health is. Do you have any opinions on that?
The research is very early, but it does appear promising. If you think about it, for most of our evolution we didn't have refrigeration, and so we had to store food with pickling and this sort of thing. And so there's probably an evolutionary match to our own health through those sorts of foods. Got a friend, Mel, from Emu Wellness, who's looking to come and give an interview on gut biome health with us. So there'll be more of that later in the year. It's a return to another part of that peasant food, for want of a better phrase, because when people were living on the land, they couldn't afford to waste anything. And if you don't waste anything, you don't need to grow as much.
I asked John what he was looking to achieve with this podcast.
I'm looking to expand and spread further my knowledge and to gain knowledge from others. I've been interested in the organic movement for a long time now. I think now is the time for it to come to a fruition. We all have the knowledge, or the knowledge is available to us all anyway. It's just a matter of spreading that knowledge to those who are unaware of it, who would like to do something for themselves but don't know how to start.
I asked John what the challenges are of growing organic food in Australia are.
Growing organically anywhere is always location dependent. And the Australian climate, varies, of course, from desert to tropical to alpine. But there are particular problems here in Australia to which we're all subject, and mostly the big one is lack of topsoil and excessive weather, basically too much rain or too little rain. So what we're doing is providing information on how to grow your own food, what other people are doing to grow their food, how they're producing it, where they're selling it. Well, I'd start off small. If it's a family, get the kids involved because they just seem to take to it intuitively. Maybe some chooks if the council allows you to have a couple. But gardening on its own is fine. You just need to think about what it is you want to grow and why. I'd start with bigger seeds to start with. Things like corn, beans, peas, or the really tiny seeds like radishes, because you get a quick return with radishes and the kids love them. You can pick them straight from the garden and, not even wash them sometimes, depending on your garden. But it's an easy thing to start. And if you only started with a, half metre by half metre square, you'd be surprised at how much food you can get out of it with a little bit of thought in the planning and the planting. Not only that, it's tax-free. The money you spend in a supermarket, you've already paid tax on. The food you pick out of your own garden is free. There might be a water cost if you're on mains water, and the cost of the seeds, but basically the food's free. It's just your time. And it's not an onerous task, particularly if you start off small. These things have a way of growing almost on their own. Well, that was the reason we had the quarter-acre backyard back last century, because you could feed a family of 4 kids and 2 adults with chooks and rabbits in the backyard plus all the veggies. With the smaller blocks now and the different no-dig methods, lasagna gardening, permaculture, all that sort of thing, you don't need anywhere near as much space. You just got to make sure it's sited right so that it gets enough sunlight. I think I had a 4-foot radius circular garden a couple of years ago that I planted half to corn to start with, and the other half was all greens, and it fed us all summer. So it's not difficult to do. It's just a matter of finding the right information and then experimenting. And whether or not you want to get involved is up to you.
Thanks, John. We'll be hearing more from author, podcaster, website owner, co-owner of the Real Food Chain, John Moore, in the coming weeks. If you want to check out his work, go to www.worldorganicnews.com. You're listening to episode 1 of the Real Food Chain. Find out more at www.realfoodchain.wordpress.com. Now, one of the people who has influenced John and I has been US food author Michael Pollan. In such books as The Omnivore's Dilemma and In Defense of Food, Michael talks about the need to return to real foods. He includes such gems of wisdom as never eating anything with more than 5 ingredients, and not to eat any food your grandmother wouldn't recognise. Here he is talking to Democracy Now!'s Amy Goodman.
And with all this new marketing based on these ideas, my new suggestion is if you want to avoid all this, simply don't buy any food you've ever seen advertised. 94% of ad budgets for food go to processed food. I mean, the broccoli growers don't have money for ad budgets. So the real food is not being advertised, and that's really all you need to know.
Okay, if you listened so far, you may be asking yourself a few questions about the Real Food Chain, what it is and what it hopes to achieve. Here's me, your host, Rich Bowden, with some thoughts about the website, the podcast, and its direction. Well, the Real Food Chain is a podcast that my friend and colleague John Moore and I are putting together. It's also linked to a website, the Real Food Chain. What we intend to do is to provide an Australian voice for organic food. People interested in organic food can get information off the web, social media, but there's less available for organic food that's related to Australia. We're aiming at people like us, people that are ordinary people, for want of a better word, and they may be interested in organic food because they've got a young family, or maybe they have a medical condition and they need to switch their diet, or perhaps they're getting old and just want to look after themselves. So it's anybody really who takes an interest. We really want to aim at people who are on average wages, say. They haven't got a whole lot of money for organic food bill. And we're trying to look at ways to not only inform them, but guide them where they can find organic food at a reasonable price. I'd like to see it used by people as a reference point, so they have somewhere to go with interviews with people that say maybe they're interested in fermented foods because they're interested in increasing the gut health, improving their diet that way. They're interested in fermented foods. So I'd like to see the real food chain be a reference point for ordinary folk, and, as I said earlier, with an Australian accent. I've had to change my own diet for medical reasons, and I've realised that you can do it, but it does take a little bit of effort. And if you have a place to go where there is information on organic food, whole foods, real foods, then it makes it so much easier. Yes, it's a very important part of the podcast is that we'll be making each episode around a topic, say fermenting or do-it-yourself gardening, organic gardening. We'll be including in that interviews with people. So we will build the podcast around interviews, but also information as well. Each article that we publish on the site will be published on Facebook page. Also, it'll be published on LinkedIn, and we're also starting a Pinterest page, and we may think about Instagram down the track. We realise now that social media is such an important part of people getting their news and information. Back to the example I gave before, if you have a young family and you want to change your diet to include more organic food, then social media is a powerful thing. You can get information, you can get ideas, and ways to shop, ways to save money. And that's it. You've been listening to episode 1 of The Real Food Chain. Thank you very much for listening, and you can find out more at realfoodchain.wordpress.com. Thanks very much. Join us for episode 2.